Our history looms large over us, shaping our present and our future. We accept the great moments and ideas detailed in history books as a matter of fact.
That's one small step for man.
But what if our understanding of historical events isn't actually all that accurate? As time passes, our perception of history can become foggier, less reliable. We begin to question the truth. From conspiracy theories and so-called fake news to stories woven together using selective facts and mysteries that have never been solved. This is the story of history's greatest myths. Transformative inventions and discoveries often seem as if they have emerged into our society fully formed, filling a space that was empty only moments earlier and quickly becoming part of the fabric of our daily lives. This perception drives prevailing myths about inventors and their inventions.
Myths persist over time because they speak to the people that tell them. We breathe them, we live them. We're living myths all the time, we just don't know it.
Yet, how history remembers these inventors is often embellished by clever marketing, propaganda, cloudy recollections, and at worst, out-and-out theft. These are the myths of history's great inventions and discoveries. Today, nearly 5 billion people in the world have used the internet. It is a marvel of modern technology, shaping the global community as we know it today. But was this digital revolution all thanks to former US Vice President Al Gore? In a television interview in March 1999, Al Gore was laying the groundwork for his campaign to be the Democratic nominee for President of the United States. Drawing on the achievements of a career in politics, Gore made a series of sweeping statements to make his case. Among them was that during his time in the United States Congress, he had taken the critical initiative in creating the internet.
During my service in the United States Congress, I took the initiative in creating the internet.
What began as an unfortunate choice of phrasing has morphed into a punchline, and the myth that Al Gore invented the internet was born.
The myth that he said he invented the internet is just too good to ignore.
Political opponents used the mistake to take aim at the man himself and discredit him for making such a bold, erroneous claim.
Keep in mind that in politics, everything's fair game. So any politician says something that can be misconstrued, it will be misconstrued.
Once the story had taken hold in the media, the prevailing public perception became Al Gore claims he invented the internet. In fact, the development of the internet was a long, winding journey and the work of many minds, a remarkable feat of collaborative technological engineering.
Engineering is that plodding work of putting one brick on top of another, and eventually you build something useful. And that's the work of thousands of people over time. And a lot of the internet is actually engineering, as distinct from invention.
Like many technological advances of the mid-20th century, the internet began with defense funding. In 1969, the US Defense Department's research arm, known as the Advanced Research Projects Agency, or ARPA, successfully connected two computers and sent information from one to the other.
The United States had an interesting view on the relationship between its defense industry and research. And it was one of the few countries that married them quite tightly, that the defense industry had a research arm and was quite willing not just to fund military research, but to fund researchers in universities to do work that might have some benefit in later years into their military endeavours or elsewhere.
By 1973, the ARPANET had grown into a network connecting over 30 academic, military, and research institutions as far away as Norway and the UK. Then, other networks began to pop up around the world.
It was all about turning the telephone from national monopolies into competitive environments. It was actually encouraging other ways of doing communications beyond simple telephony.
The process was the result of many talented minds working to create consistent systems and protocols to connect the world. Then came the intercommunication catalyst of the World Wide Web.
So the internet is actually that world of computers exchanging data. The World Wide Web is actually an application, a way of using that network to structure information. In some ways, the World Wide Web could be looked at as the collection of libraries on this planet, the repository of this structured information.
Three of the key principles of the World Wide Web were first proposed by the UK's Tim Berners-Lee in 1989 and developed over the next 2 years. These helped to shape the way web pages and documents were findable, displayable, and linkable across the web. Then in 1991, Berners-Lee made the code to create web pages and the browsers to view them freely available online. But these technological marvels were the work of many individuals, not just Berners-Lee. But what is true is that from these and many other advances, the information age was born. And while Al Gore may not have invented the internet, like many myths, at its heart is a grain of truth. He is widely credited with recognizing the potential of the internet and being one of its early advocates and supporters. In 1991, he introduced legislation in the US that poured hundreds of millions of dollars into connecting computers in schools, universities, and other institutions, and creating the national infrastructure dubbed the Information Superhighway.
Underneath there, though, was this germ of truth that said that the US administration in the early 1990s saw enough of the writing on the wall to seed some money in to this activity, to just give it a gentle nudge. And it worked.
And so Al Gore is saying that, look, I actually shepherded this through Congress and helped make it happen. But it's so much more fun to say he invented the internet.
Fantastic. I think there's a lot of excitement here. The technologies are very interesting.
While Gore's turn of phrase was an accidental exaggeration, he did in fact recognize the importance of the internet and had a hand in making it available to the public at large. And for this, he was inducted into the Internet Hall of Fame. But while Gore's claim of invention has been widely disputed, cloudy recollections of the past have gifted another inventor with the full credit for an ingenious device, in which he was undoubtedly a prime mover, but not the sole author. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, American inventor Thomas Edison patented 1,093 inventions. But he is perhaps best known as the inventor of the light bulb.
Thomas Edison is the person we first think of when we think of an inventor. He sort of epitomizes the sort of mythology of the great, 19th century lone inventor.
Yet the notion that Edison solely invented the light bulb is a myth that has endured throughout the 20th century and beyond. The real story of its invention dates back to the early 19th century. The first demonstration of a working light bulb took place in 1802. This was conducted by British chemist Humphrey Davy, who passed electricity through a filament to create incandescent light. But in those early years, Davy had a problem. When exposed to air, the platinum filament through which the electric current was passed would burn away. 7 years later, Davy demonstrated a more reliable electric lamp. Known as the arc light, it worked by creating an electric arc between two carbon electrodes. But the light it created was intense, and the lamp itself so bulky it could only be used for public lighting. The challenge was to create a light bulb that was small enough and safe enough for use in the home. Enter British physicist and inventor Joseph Swan. Swan was an early developer of the incandescent light bulb, and in 1860, Swan patented his advance on Davy's initial idea, a carbonized paper filament sealed into a glass vacuum bulb. But while he wasn't able to successfully demonstrate his model until 1878, his home was the first in the world to be wired for domestic electric lighting.
For about 40 years, there had been people working on incandescent light bulbs. There were lots of patents, but nobody had actually commercialized electric light, or at least electric incandescent light.
The same year, halfway around the world, at his research laboratory in Menlo Park, New Jersey, 31-year-old Thomas Edison entered the race to get electric light bulbs into the home. He had built an industrial research lab with the proceeds from the sale of his invention of the quadruplex telegraph for $10,000, and it soon became a hub for innovation.
Menlo Park is recognized as the first R&D lab created for new inventions. And so to develop the electric light system, Edison really goes from just a research laboratory to a research and development laboratory, trying to find commercially viable ways to create the system and then to manufacture it.
For the next 2 years, he and his team are believed to have designed and tested anywhere from 1,200 to 6,000 separate models.
So Menlo Park is where Edison kind of creates this new institution. And there are lots of other inventors, scientists, businessmen who come to Menlo Park to see what he had done. And it becomes kind of a model. So other inventors began to develop laboratories similar to this.
In 1880, Edison made a crucial breakthrough by using a carbonized bamboo filament inside a vacuum bulb. It was able to burn for over 1,200 hours, far longer than anyone had been able to achieve thus far. But some believe Edison merely improved upon Swan's design, which had been patented 20 years earlier. Swan eventually sued Edison for patent infringement, and as a result, they entered into an uneasy alliance.
Edison had the filament technology, he had the system, but Swan had that vacuum technology, and that was really crucial. In Britain, the Edison company and the Swan company, after battling each other in the courts, decided, you know, this is expensive and it's not getting us anywhere, let's combine. And that's ultimately what they do. They create the United Edison Swan Company that became known as Ediswan.
But a light bulb still had limited applications. Edison had grander commercial ambitions and wanted his electric light to be part of a system rather than just a lamp. In 1882, his first central power station was built in New York City. And as the electricity network expanded, so too did the usefulness of the light bulb, changing the face of modern society. Change that Edison had undoubtedly helped to envision and facilitate.
People see him as the great lone inventor. Others see him as this person who took other people's ideas, right? And he's kind of in the middle, this brilliant genius who is able to conceptualize these technologies and bring them into use. That, of course, ignores the fact that he was never a lone inventor. He was always part of a team. This is a really crucial part of Edison's success, but it's not one that most people understood at the time, because in the 19th century, it's the individual who's sort of recognized as the creative force. And in fact, the patent system actually recognizes individuals, not groups.
Thus, the US patent system recognized Edison as the main inventor amongst what we now know was a particularly talented group of visionaries at Menlo Park. It was also Edison's self-marketing as a genius inventor that helped to solidify his fame in the early 20th century and to be celebrated more than a century later. But there is another visionary American inventor who fought for a seat at the table in a male-dominated industry and who has been largely forgotten. It's the early 1930s, known as the Great Depression. Millions of Americans are out of work. Among them is Charles Darrow, but he has a brilliant idea. A board game where participants buy up property and housing until they gain a monopoly over their peers. Darrow would eventually sell the rights to prolific toy manufacturers Parker Brothers, and a hit game was born.
Of capitalism, money, buying up properties, raising the rent, buying out your competition, kind of remains today too. I couldn't think of a game that's more relevant than Monopoly.
Charles Darrow very early on becomes a huge part of the marketing of Monopoly. He has a family to support and he's fallen on hard times like millions of Americans have. And he goes into his basement and poof, out comes Monopoly.
When Darrow was asked how he came up with this ingenious idea, he deflected, describing its invention as entirely unexpected and illogical. In fact, it wasn't his idea at all. Charles Darrow first learned of the game in 1932, when he and his wife played it at a friend's house. Generally called the Monopoly game, it didn't come in a box, had no written rules, and was shared from one person to the next. But the original version did have a name and a creator. The Landlord's Game was created by Elizabeth or Lizzie McGee in Washington, D.C., and patented by her in 1904. McGee had been working as a stenographer at the time, but was also an intensely political, social progressive who had managed to buy and run her own home, an unusual feat for a woman at the beginning of the 20th century.
So Lizzie McGee was a really fascinating woman. She was a outspoken activist, and she does something really incredible, which is she decides to make a game to teach people about her political ideas.
She set out with the goal of creating a fun board game that explored the emerging social problems surrounding income inequality and the power of monopolists. The game would demonstrate the consequences of what she described as land grabbing and the preoccupation with the accumulation of wealth.
So in the first version of Monopoly, the Landlord's Game, Lizzie McGee creates two rule sets. She creates a monopolist rule set, which is the one that we play today, or really familiar, where you're trying to get total control of the board. And she makes an anti-monopolist rule set, one where you're trying to break things apart. And I've always thought it was interesting that given those two options, we've always drifted towards the one where we have to clobber each other in order to win.
McGee was the first person in American history to apply patents to a board game.
In 1904, Lizzie McGee receives a patent for her game, and this is a huge deal because fewer than 1% of patents were granted to women at the time. And if you look at the patent, she actually uses her initials, not her first name, Elizabeth, which would have given it away, likely. So you would think, this woman's invented this game, she's patented it against all odds. How did it end up on store shelves in the mid-1930s without her credited and with Parker Brothers selling it? So it's a bit of a mystery. When Parker Brothers acquires the Darrow game, they soon realize that they have a problem. They're starting to publish it and people are writing in and saying, Charles Darrow didn't invent this game. So they write to Darrow and they say, hey, when you have a moment, can you clear up some of this? Like help us understand the story behind the game. And Darrow waffles, and essentially Parker Brothers strike this deal with Lizzie McGee.
George Parker himself struck a deal with McGee to publish The Landlord's Game and two other games, but they were never published. And though McGee received $500 for her patents, Parker believed they could issue Monopoly as a completely separate game, which by now has sold hundreds of millions of copies around the world. And regardless of the game's true origins, Charles Darrow continues to be identified as its sole inventor.
I think that one of the reasons why the Darrow story has stuck with us for so long is it's a great story. Even if it's not true, who doesn't want to believe that they too can go in their basement and innovate?
While Lizzie McGee was the creative mind behind one of the world's most famous board games, the theft of Monopoly relegated her story to the margins. Her original socially progressive, anti-monopolist teaching tool evolved into a game that celebrated capitalism and cemented both Darrow and the Parker brothers' place in history.
Darrow's obituary was in the New York Times. He's hailed as the inventor. It's loud, it's proud. And one of the last traces that we have of Lizzie McGee is the 1940 US Census. And what I think is so interesting about that is that under occupation, she lists maker of games, and she lists her income as zero. So if she made any money, by then it would have been gone. So I think that this persists today, this myth of the male inventor. We love a story about a boy genius. We love the idea of a genius that just from thin air can cultivate something incredible. But we also have women geniuses, and Lizzie McGee, I believe, was one of them.
But Lizzie McGee was far from the only woman whose genius and intellect was erased from history by self-serving men. In 1962, scientists James Watson, Francis Crick, and Maurice Wilkins stood on stage and received the Nobel Prize for Physiology or Medicine. Recognition for the incredible scientific achievement of mapping the structure of human DNA and its double helix shape. Yet, the accomplishment was not theirs alone. The true story can be found in a lab at London's King's College with work that began in 1951. It was there that scientist Rosalind Franklin was painstakingly using X-ray photography to capture images of the structure of DNA molecules. She wasn't the only scientist seeking the answers to the DNA mystery, but it would be her image, known as Photo 51, that would completely change the race to map human DNA.
James Watson, Francis Crick, and Maurice Wilkins all were molecular biologists working in England at the time. Watson and Crick were at Cambridge working in the laboratory, and Maurice Wilkins was working at King's College, London, more directly with Rosalind Franklin.
Rosalind, as a researcher, had a number of attributes, but one of the things that was recognised about her was she was somebody that sort of had golden hands. You know, she could get very difficult experiments to work where other people perhaps couldn't. She had a preparation of DNA, and she obtained very, very beautiful X-ray images from that preparation that other people had not been able to obtain before.
Franklin and her student Ray Gosling captured Photo 51 in May 1952.
That was a photograph of a particular form of DNA where the images were very, very clear, an arrangement of dots radiating out from a central point.
It showed in clear black and white an X shape that Franklin immediately understood to be a double helix. From this image, she took exact measurements of the diameter and pitch of the helix and the separation between each fiber. Crucial data to create an accurate DNA model.
The double helix structure of DNA underpins how DNA functions, both as a source of genetic information and a source of information that can be almost endlessly copied through generations, both in between cells in an organism, but between organisms themselves through the process of inheritance. The ramifications of that discovery have been very profound in terms of allowing people to understand the genetic basis of disease, how diseases are acquired and inherited in individuals, and all kinds of applications.
Rosalind Franklin had made a discovery that would immeasurably enhance our understanding of life on Earth and help to sustain it. But she wasn't the only one on this race to discover and understand DNA. Franklin had an uneasy relationship with her colleague and rival at King's College, Maurice Wilkins. Wilkins was also working on the structure of DNA and was friends with two scientists from Cambridge, James Watson and Francis Crick. The two had already started working on their own attempt to map DNA. But by the time Franklin was taking Photo 51, they hadn't succeeded in capturing the data they needed.
So eventually Watson visited King's College one day and Wilkins showed him photograph 51. In James Watson's book, he actually recounts the moment that he saw the photo. He sort of said that his pulse started to race. The extreme clarity of the photo made him realise that DNA was indeed a helix.
Rosalind Franklin was unaware that Watson had seen her photo, nor that Watson and Crick had a copy of her 1952 research summary that included details of the painstaking measurements she had taken.
It's believed that during Rosalind Franklin's lifetime, she was never aware that her results were shared with Watson. Her relationship, I think, with Wilkins at the time was such that they virtually weren't speaking, so it's not clear that Wilkins ever told her. It's not clear that Watson or Crick ever told her either.
The next year, Watson and Crick published their DNA model in the scientific journal Nature. Franklin also published details of her findings in the same issue, noting at the time that their research seemed to be consistent with her findings, not knowing that they had, in fact, based their work on hers.
And it's true that Watson and Crick didn't give enough reference to or enough credit to Rosalind Franklin's work in their initial publications.
4 years after publishing her research, Franklin tragically died at the age of 37 from ovarian cancer, before her contemporaries won their Nobel Prize. Six years after they won, Watson released a memoir in which he admitted they had used Franklin's data without her knowledge, and in which he also made some unnecessary comments about her, remarking on her lack of femininity and choices of clothing, and how miserable it was to be told by a woman not to venture an opinion on a subject on which he had no training. Perhaps a male colleague with the same attributes would have been deemed a demanding co-worker at worst, or a misunderstood genius at best. But this was not the case for Watson's memories of Franklin.
I think his depiction of Franklin was inaccurate, firstly. It portrayed Rosalind Franklin as somebody who was a very difficult person to work with, who was, needlessly argumentative and emotional about her work. But she had a history of very productive collaborations in other settings with men.
Rosalind Franklin had a very direct personality and was very probing in her questions and was very skeptical when people would come to her with sort of half-baked ideas. This we see in James Watson's book, The Double Helix, again, because all throughout the book, he's sort of complaining what a stumbling block she was and how we can't get anything past her because she says she poo-poos everything and shoots it all down. Later on, after she's dead, they realize, of course, this is one of the reasons they're able to make these discoveries. It's because she held them to an extremely high standard.
Released in 1968, Watson's book was a biased account, designed to embellish his own role and diminish his colleagues. But his scathing words actually helped cement Rosalind Franklin's position as a feminist icon, an overlooked, talented genius in a field dominated by men.
So Rosalind Franklin, in a sense, I think she exemplifies a lot of the struggles that women have experienced.
The myth of the male inventor recurs throughout history. And though Rosalind Franklin deserved much more credit for her efforts than she was given, for others, the opposite may be true. The Nazi Party rose to power in the 1920s and 30s, at a time when Germany's economy was suffering due to the burden of World War I reparations, coupled with a global economic crisis. The early years of the regime, characterized by the alarming rise of anti-Semitic propaganda and violence, also focused on the economic and military strength of the nation. A significant part of this was the building of the Autobahn, a network of high-quality highways connecting the nation. The Nazis were selling the idea that this project would modernize the country and provide much-needed jobs to the people. But did the Nazis really invent the Autobahn as they claimed? And was it the stimulus for the German economic miracle which followed, as their propaganda made out?
The Autobahn construction project was hugely important for the Nazi Party. It showed the world that, far from just being a bunch of gangsters and mobsters who like beating up Jewish people, this was actually a government that had sensible nationwide economic and employment policies.
Each time a new part of the Autobahn began construction, Hitler would be there for a highly orchestrated photo opportunity. The Autobahn was positioned as a shining symbol of the modernity and technical prowess of Nazi Germany.
It was a complete kind of smokescreen for what was really going on. But it certainly represented something that the Nazis could say to the world, look, we're a modern, go-getting state. Fascism is a far more future-looking form of government than democracy.
But while the prevailing perception of the Autobahn project was that it got the nation back to work, this wasn't really the case. At its height, the project employed about 120,000 people and was plagued by illness, death, and hunger. Though strikes were extremely rare in Nazi Germany, workers got so fed up they would strike, and anyone who participated was sent to concentration camps. As war broke out, road workers went to fight, and the Autobahn was increasingly constructed by Jewish forced laborers and prisoners. Even after construction all but ended between 1941 and 1942, the Nazi Party continued to distribute films and photos of men hard at work on new sections of the Autobahn, a project more propaganda than purpose. Civil engineer Fritz Todt had been chosen to deliver the Autobahn. It was his vision of a road network that would connect the nation.
Fritz Todt was a senior Nazi Party official, and he was a major construction engineer. And he seized on the idea of Autobahns, and he's one of the, perhaps the main reason why the Autobahns became seen or known or propagandized as a Nazi project. He said, we need to take this and turn it into something useful for the party, in addition to something useful for the country. In a crucial report, he wrote that these were to be, quote, the Führer's roads. So this is an absolute construction of a myth about a construction project.
One of the greatest myths about Hitler, and indeed about the Nazi regime, is this idea that the Nazis invented the Autobahn. They take a lot of credit for something that was already happening a long time before the Nazis came to power. In fact, the first Autobahn was built in 1928 near Hamburg.
Then, in 1932, the first German crossroads-free motorway was built in Cologne. But when the Nazis came to power in 1933, they reclassified the motorway as a country road, rewriting history so that they could claim credit for being the first to build the Autobahn.
So the idea that Hitler invented the Autobahn is a complete myth. Ideas and proposals for these sorts of roads had come up in the 1920s, as they had in the United States and in other parts of Europe.
So although the Nazis did build Autobahns, they did not invent them.
This was a successful manipulation, twisting and obscuring the truth that would become a leitmotif of the Nazi Party throughout its catastrophic period in power. In truth, few people even owned cars in Germany, and so the Autobahn really was propaganda for propaganda's sake. Another man's ability to successfully market his brand would see him rise to prominence in the early 20th century. There was a time in the early 20th century that the Model T Ford was the quintessential car. By the end of its run, more than 15 million had been manufactured. Given its popularity, it would be easy to buy into the myth that gives the invention of the automobile to Henry Ford. In reality, however, the story of the automobile goes back a little further. Henry Ford established the Ford Motor Company in 1903 and produced the first Model T 5 years later. But the origins of our modern cars date back to the 19th century. The first vehicle powered by a gas engine was patented in 1886 by inventor Carl Benz, with support from his wife, Bertha Benz.
Benz is the one who comes up with the first really successful gasoline-powered automobile. He figures out how to make a cheaper version that could be built in greater numbers. So this is in the 1880s and 1890s, before Ford is really himself working on automobiles. And so the development of the automobile is not the story of a single individual or a single company. It's a whole network of companies and individuals who are developing this technology, making it commercially, selling it, putting it out on the roads.
Carl Benz filed the patent for this car after long research periods at the 29th of January 1886, and that's worldwide seen as the birth of the first automobile.
With Ford decades behind Benz, how is his name still synonymous with the invention of the automobile? Perhaps it was a matter of clever branding.
We tend to tell the history of new technologies, at least up through World War I, as the story of individuals. Beginning in World War II and beyond, more and more technologies associated with companies rather than individuals. And one of the things that people like Ford or Edison represent is this sort of transition where the technologies associated with their name, because they're companies, have their name.
Ford's name created a brand recognition for the Model T previously unheard of. And while this car may not have been the first automobile, no one could produce cars more swiftly and efficiently.
What Ford did, which was probably as significant as any other development in early automobile industry, is figured out how to mass produce cars to greatly lower their price, make them a common means of transportation instead of just something that the rich could afford. And so in that respect, that's sort of how Ford's name becomes associated with the automobile in people's minds.
So while the myth of Ford as the inventor of the automobile was never true, it was the clever use of assembly lines in his factories that brought cars to the masses.
Doesn't all start at once with this idea, preconceived assembly line. They begin to put the pieces together and ultimately realize, oh, we can move the car chassis on tracks, and we can have conveyor belts and chutes to move pieces or individual things like screws through to where the workers are. And instead of moving the workers to the car and to the things that they're working on for putting on the car, we'll move those pieces to sub-assembly lines. And so the workers will stay in place and everything will come to them and then move on to the next station.
For his revolutionary product line, Ford took inspiration from other manufacturing workflows, citing in particular the efficient disassembly process of the meatpacking industry. And by adapting this successful model to his own automobile construction company, Ford created cars on a hitherto unknown industrial scale.
So all of a sudden, the automobile became not just a form of transportation the rich could use, but something that became common. So that later on, Herbert Hoover could campaign on every family having a car, right? And that's in part because of what happened with the development of the Model T and the mass production of this new technology.
Clever marketing had Ford as the face of the company. But perhaps his genius was that he constantly surrounded himself with creative colleagues. Ford was positioned as the inventor of the assembly line in his factories, but credit may actually be due to his production chief, Charles Sorensen, who painstakingly developed the right timings and sequences for the assembly line. In his autobiography, Sorensen describes Ford as the sponsor of the innovation, not its architect. But what Ford did, with the help of some talented staff, was to take the production line to an entirely new level. He was also the first to use an automated conveyor system, which further increased efficiency on the line. With this revolutionary workflow, Ford was able to reduce the time it took to manufacture a Model T to just 90 minutes. It also meant he could increase production of the Model T from 300,000 in 1913 to over 2 million by 1923, by which time Ford was producing more than half of America's cars.
Really, what Ford did was figure out how to design and build a low-cost automobile, not to invent the automobile. And I think this is every much as important as the initial invention.
More than 100 years later, and the assembly line is the prevailing model across manufacturing industries. And as for the car, there are an estimated 1.4 billion in the world today, a legacy that Henry Ford was instrumental in creating. While Ford's myth of invention is one of near history, some myths go so far back it's even harder to distinguish fact from fiction. Food is an incredibly important part of our daily lives. It is more than just sustenance. It is a social bonding experience and an expression of cultural identity. Tracing the origins of food and food production can take us on an enlightening and at times surprising journey back through our history. Today, the croissant is a quintessential part of French cuisine. But as recently as the 19th century, the croissant was considered by the French to be a foreign food.
The croissant today has become a French pastry. It was originally an Austrian pastry called the Kipfel.
Croissants are a style of breakfast pastry called viennoiserie, linking the croissant to the Austrian city of Vienna. If we can trace the ancestor of the modern-day croissant to the Kipfel, how did the Kipfel come to be? One story is that the Kipfel was created in 1683 to commemorate the Viennese defeat of the invading Ottoman army after a baker raised the alarm. The crescent shape of the pastry is meant to represent the crescent moon symbol of the Ottomans. Another version dates its creation to 1686 and the liberation of Buda in Austria from the Ottoman occupation. Yet there is also evidence to suggest the Kipfel was around long before this. A poem references the baked good being presented to Duke Leopold in 1227. What also remains a mystery is how the Kipfel came to favor in France. The myth is that Marie Antoinette, homesick for Vienna, introduced it. But the emergence of the croissant is more likely due to a Viennese man named Auguste Zang, who opened the first Viennese bakery in Paris in 1838.
And among many other products, he introduced this crescent-shaped roll, the kipfel. When the French bakers began to imitate it, they just called it a crescent, which in French is croissant.
But it would take a while for it to become the French icon it's known as today.
Well, it wasn't until almost the end of the 19th century that the French began to apply what's basically a French technique, making layers of dough with layers of butter on top of it, another layer of dough on top of it. And that's what produces the flaky croissant.
Perhaps even more ubiquitous than the croissant in Western cuisine is the sandwich.
To create a sandwich that works, the flavors marry, it's seasonal. So that was the reason for it.
It looks fantastic. I'd buy it if I could afford it.
And its origin is also the subject of myth, legend, and debate. The invention of the sandwich is often attributed to the 4th Earl of Sandwich, John Montagu, who in 1762 is said to have requested his servants bring him a dinner made from 2 pieces of bread filled with sliced meat. Exactly how it caught on in London society and across the European continent is unknown. Regardless of its trajectory into society, as others ordered the meal, they named it after the Earl, who had popularized the dish among the English gentry. And the rest is history. Or is it?
We know that there were open-faced sandwiches. Virgil notably wrote about Aeneas putting food on top of a flatbread. I think it's in the 17th century there's a reference to the Dutch cutting off pieces of beef and putting them on top of bread.
But what were the circumstances of this tasty invention that involved putting not 1, but 2 slices of bread around a piece of meat? One version of the story comes from one of the Earl's biographers. In this version, he is cast as the dedicated worker, so diligent that he asked for his food in a form which would enable him to eat with one hand and work with the other. The more common and less savory version of events is that the Earl was a notorious gambler, and that on one particular evening, spending 24 hours at the gambling table, he requested the sandwich so he wouldn't have to stop playing while he ate. But history also records another version of the story, which harks back to 1762. Edward Gibbon, a historian and scholar, had been to the Cocoa Tree Club in London, and in his diary wrote that 20 or 30 of the first men in the kingdom supping at little tables upon a bit of cold meat or a sandwich. Whether the Earl of Sandwich ordered his portable snack for work or play, or at all, the sandwich has since become a ubiquitously popular food item enjoyed around the world. While Montagu may not have invented the dish, while it carries his name, the myth will live on. History's great discoveries and inventions change the way we live our lives. It is easy to believe the myths that swirl around these contributions and contributors. Their influence is so great that they become larger than life. The reality at the center of the myth is no less incredible. That humans advance ever onward, each amazing achievement standing on the shoulders of those who have gone before.